Trump placed a trusted ally on the most sensitive front involving Lula's government by nominating Daniel Perez as the ambassador of the United States in Brasilia. Precisely at the moment when Washington is tightening the clampdown on the PCC and Comando Vermelho, turning Brazilian organized crime into an issue of international security. On this Tuesday, June 2, 2026, the move lands as a harsh warning in the lap of Itamaraty. The White House doesn't just want diplomatic talks, it wants someone closely watching Brazil, Lula's relationship with Washington, the government's response to the factions, the pressure on big tech companies, and the advance of Chinese influence in the region. Perez is a Republican from Florida, the son of Cubans, connected to the same political environment as Marco Rubio. And he arrives with a profile that scares the left, because he understands the rhetoric used by governments that call international pressure an attack on sovereignty. When the real problem is at home, why did Trump send Mini Rubio to Brasilia? Lula tried to shield. What's the problem? And how can this appointment change the game against the PT? I'll tell you all about it in a moment. If you like this kind of straightforward and no-nonsense content, consider subscribing because we have videos like this every day. The White House sent to the US Senate the nomination of Daniel Perez to be the United States ambassador to Brazil. The position had been vacant since Elizabeth Baird left, still during Joe Biden's administration, and the diplomatic mission in Brasilia had been led on an interim basis. Trump's choice doesn't come at just any moment. Daniel Perez still needs to go through the United States Senate before officially taking office. Even so, the nomination already carries political weight. He presides over the Florida House of Representatives, is a Republican, was born in New York, grew up in Florida, and is loyal. He is the son of Cuban immigrants. This detail matters because Florida is currently one of the strongest centers of American conservative politics against leftist regimes in Latin America. It is also the political territory of Marco Rubio, Trump's Secretary of State, and one of the main hardliners against dictatorships, drug trafficking, and the influence of United States adversaries on the continent. The Lula administration wanted to treat the American decision against the PCC and Comando Vermelho as an outside overreaction, but Washington changed the conversation. The problem moved beyond Brazilian public security and entered the field of hemispheric security. For Trump, a faction that moves money, controls territory, crosses borders, launders money, and creates networks outside Brazil cannot be treated as a domestic issue. It's comfortable for Brasilia to manage at its own pace. The message is simple. When crime grows too much, it leaves a trail. A financial, political, and international trail. Marco Rubio announced the designation of the factions as specially designated global terrorists and as foreign terrorist organizations. That's when things heat up for Lula. The Brazilian government may shout about sovereignty, but the real question is, why have the largest Brazilian factions grown so much that they've become a direct target for Washington? The average citizen isn't concerned with fancy diplomatic speeches while they see gangs taking over cities, controlling communities, influencing prisons, laundering money, and creating real fear in daily life. The White House noticed this weak spot. Trump didn't need to invent a crisis against Lula. He shed light on a crisis that Brazil itself allowed to grow. The appointment of Daniel Perez intensifies this pressure because it places a political representative in Brasilia who is aligned with the Trump administration and in Marco Rubio's orbit. He's not a politically neutral choice. He's a Republican from Florida with a conservative base, a public career, and a tough stance against Latin American socialism. For Lula's foreign ministry, this changes the atmosphere. An ambassador with this profile tends to closely monitor Brazil's reaction to measures against the factions, the government's behavior in the face of sanctions, and Brasilia's attempt to frame the discussion around sovereignty. The Planalto also faces another problem. The left's narrative becomes more difficult when the pressure comes with money, training, and structure. The United States government created a fund of $8.8 million, about 44.2 million reais, to finance investigations against terrorist organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean. The program provides training for investigators, prosecutors, and judges, as well as focusing on dismantling financial networks linked to terrorism and transnational crime. If Washington offers resources to combat the financial network of criminal factions, Brazil needs to explain why that would be a bad thing. If the argument is sovereignty, the right-wing response is straightforward. Sovereignty can't become an excuse to let the faction grow. True sovereignty is assertiveness. Protecting citizens, cutting off criminal funding, arresting leaders, dismantling money laundering, and preventing criminal organizations from acting as a parallel power. The discomfort grows because the discussion is happening at the same time that ministers and allies from the government side are advocating for more control over social media and more pressure on big tech companies. The Supreme Federal Court recently decided on new parameters for holding digital platforms accountable. And the government issued decrees giving more power to official bodies in the fight against content considered illegal in the digital environment. For the right-wing base, the picture seems clear. The same government that complains about American pressure against factions wants more power to control speech on social media. It's at this intersection that Daniel Perez becomes a strategic figure. He enters the Brazilian debate as the Lula government faces pressure in public security and technology, diplomacy, and its relationship with the United States. The ambassador nominated by Trump won't need to make loud speeches to bother Brasilia. It will be enough to follow the facts, receive reports, talk with political sectors, speak with American companies, observe the legal environment, and report to Washington how the Brazilian government reacts to each move. The nickname Mini Rubio sticks precisely because Perez represents a political generation shaped by conservative Florida, by Cuban-American anti-communism, and by a tough security agenda against cartels, dictatorships, and transnational networks. Lula knows this kind of pressure very well. This is not the slow, behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Now Itamaraty has to deal with someone who arrives with Trump's backing. While Brazil's government tries to downplay the case, Washington raises the issue. If it tries to turn the classification of the factions into a political attack, the White House points to money laundering, trafficking, and regional expansion. If it tries to blame the Brazilian right, the concrete fact remains. PCC and Comando Vermelho are in the sights of the United States because they have grown too much and have become a risk beyond Brazil's borders. The left tries to sell the idea that Trump is using Brazil to play politics, but the Brazilian who lives surrounded by insecurity understands the other side of the story. When the state fails, someone fills the void. When the faction fills the void, dirty money enters the economy. When that money crosses the border, the problem is no longer just national. And when a power like the United States decides to follow the money, a lot of people start losing sleep. The nomination also touches on another sensitive point, the struggle for influence on the continent. Trump has made it clear that he wants to reposition the United States in the Western Hemisphere. This involves fighting criminal organizations, reducing opportunities for strategic adversaries, and closely monitoring governments that get too close to Beijing. Lula's Brazil is at the center of this board because it is large, has economic weight, natural resources, and a consumer market. And there are governments that prefer to pose as leaders of the global south, while Washington focuses on security, technology, and money. However, Perez is not arriving as a diplomatic tourist, he is arriving as a political signal. The United States Embassy in Brasilia once again has a Trump-appointed nominee at a time when the relationship between the two governments is filled with tension. Trump is looking at Brasilia, Rubio is looking at the factions, and Washington now has a name, an agenda, and money to keep track of what the PT does when the issue stops being just talk and becomes an international demand. I am Milson Alves, internationalist, and my purpose is to keep you well informed with the truth every day. The news links are in the video description. Leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and at the end, take a look at the comments so you can be even more engaged with the Milson Alves community.